last year or 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's very different. Not just our lives, but our workplaces. Every day we are faced with pressures to perform, to firefight, and to problem solve. Our workloads are increasing. We get interrupted by more and more distractions, and often we feel fatigued by it all. Today, I've invited our own Dr. Steve Conway, Director of Psychological Safety and Leadership, to join me in a conversation on how we can not only stay calm, but also carry on and find ways to build resilience in ourselves and in our teams to manage this uncertainty. So, Steve, thank you for joining me. And as we get started, please let's share in the chat what you're most hoping to learn and get help with from today's discussion. Maybe some leading questions around, is it dealing with distractions, managing stress that becomes from competing priorities, or maybe even recognizing signs of stress before they become serious concerns, or maybe some other things. So, Steve, I'm going to bring you on board and kind of let you kick off this session, and we'll have a discussion and see where this goes, and then bring in some audience participation as well.
Perfect.
Perfect. All right. I'm just, you ever get that moment where you have a glitch, where everything just kind of wants to give you a moment? Maybe some of the questions we can chat about, Steve. When it comes to attention, we are faced with way too many things to do, how to prioritize, how to focus our attention on what matters. What are some of your thoughts on, guiding, anyone that's joining us today on how to deal with this?
hmm Yeah, and there is a lot going on, and I do like that, keep calm and carry on. The only thing about that is sometimes, carrying on comes at an expense to us if we're not being mindful about the impact on us. When we're overloaded, when we've got so many things kind of bombarding us from all angles, our brains really they go into kind of survival mode, and they tend to treat everything as though it's equally urgent. So our ability to kind of discern what is important from urgent starts to kind of dissipate somewhat. And usually, I mean, and this might sound really simple, but one of the best things that we can do when we notice this is happening to try to reset is just stop what you're doing and take a breath, right? There's something about breath that makes a huge difference. Because obviously, if you're not breathing, you're dead. So breathing's good for you. So stop, breathe, and really just kind of take that moment and just kind of think, what actually needs my attention right now? Because we tend to focus so much on all the urgent things bombarding us that we don't tend to focus on the most important things. And we get those two confused a lot. So we want to focus on the things that typically have the biggest impact on safety, on people, or operations. But again, you won't be able to kind of parse these things out unless you've stopped and taken that breath and taken that moment. Try breaking these problems, these larger problems, into smaller next steps, or chunk them, and instead of trying to solve everything all at once, because we're not good at doing that. Human beings, I know so many people say, "Oh, I'm a great multitasker." Really, none of us are really great multitaskers because the way our attention works, if we're bouncing between one urgent thing and another, we lose that concentration. Our mind takes time to get back into the previous task. So since we're not very good multitaskers, what we do is we're switching our attention constantly, and then we become really kind of cognitively and mentally fatigued.
Lots of great nuggets there, Steve. There's a great book. It's called, Stop Worrying, Start Living. And how
Mhm.
much is that, when we're constantly faced with, this distraction or, overwhelmed, that we start to worry about our performance, and that worrying is also now what keeps us up at night. I mean, is there any tips on how to shut that brain off? And, we know that most things that we fear or worry about never come to fruition. They're just
Yeah.
our brains kind of just firing and giving us something to panic about. But is there any kind of direction or support that you could give, people that maybe are worriers by nature?
And I actually tend to be one of those people. I come from a long line of really skillful warriors. And there's this quote I love. It's by Mark Twain, and I always butcher a little bit. But Mark Twain says, in his lifetime, he suffered 1,000 tragedies, but only a few of them actually happened. So
Yes.
so much, so we're always projecting these kind of worst case scenarios. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective why we do that. If we think, life is stressful now, I think it was a lot more stressful when we were hunter-gatherers trying to survive when everything was out to eat us. So we developed the ability to scan for danger in our environment all the time as a survival mechanism. The thing is, the world has changed. So we're not, I don't know about you, I can't remember the last time I saw a saber-toothed tiger, but the structure of our brains haven't evolved since those times, right? So they don't know the difference between a social threat or a work-based stressor from a survival one. And so I think, when we're in these kind of moments of high stress or we catch our mind kind of traveling down this kind of catastrophic storyline, one of the most practical things that we can do is really like just again, it's always about stopping and having short periods of uninterrupted focus, right? Because when we have all these things bombarding us, it makes it hard to focus on what's going on. We want to, again, like when we're stressed out, even 20 to 30 minutes, if let's say you're in an office setting, 20 to 30 minutes without emails, team messages, or phones, what those can do if we turn off those alerts, those constant pings, is they improve our concentration, they lower our stress. And when we're stressed out, our brains tend to automatically take us to those kind of catastrophic worst case scenarios you were talking about. I think as people leaders, you really want to be mindful about, encouraging people to try finishing one task before jumping to another one whenever possible. Work is always seems to be like, well, you need to do this and then add this on the plate and add this on the plate. That leads to overwhelm for a lot of people. If we can develop like small habits, right? Again, like those silencing those notifications that drive me up the wall when I see them pinging or hear them pinging. If we can step away from like noisy areas, even briefly, to kind of regulate our nervous system, take a short break before moving to another demanding task. All these things, what they do is they give your brain just moments of recovery from this barrage of stimulation that we're getting. And I would think, and it's different for folks that are on a manufacturing floor, because in those settings, distractions are even harder to get rid of, or they're harder to eliminate because the environments themselves are often busy, noisy, fast moving. And the goal here is again is not perfect focus because that's impossible. But how do we reduce unnecessary mental overload so that we can stay attentive to the work and the risks around them? So, a couple of things that we could do: keep communication really clear, really concise, especially during high pressure moments. Right. So too many changing instructions create obvious confusion and stress. So kind of like stick to the message, stick to the instructions that were given. If possible, reduce unnecessary interruptions when people are doing a task, and particularly safety sensitive tasks. Because every time we're focusing on something, every time we get distracted away from it, it's harder to get back into that original task. I think encouraging people to take, again, those brief mental resets to regulate your nervous system between particularly demanding tasks, even if it's like just stopping for a minute, right? Taking a breath, stretching, or do some kind of something that will help you reset your attention before moving on to the next kind of task. Um, I think I've already mentioned about, try to limit the amount of, people being pulled in multiple directions by competing priorities. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to get done, but if we're constantly throwing new things at somebody before they finish the other one, it makes it really difficult. And I think there's just some housekeeping things, the more our workspace is organized, where there's clutter. Like when we have clutter and chaos and we can't find the things that we need, or we're stepping over things, first of all, it's a safety hazard, but it also leads to increased cognitive overload because you can't work efficiently. You've always got to stop. Where's the stuff I need to do to my job? And as leaders, I think importantly, we need to create an environment where employees feel free to speak up. Say, hey, I'm struggling. I'm feeling like mentally overloaded and taxed and distracted. Like rather than just trying to push things through while they're unfocused, because that makes it much more unsafe, right? So, you know, if we can avoid adding additional stressors to an already stressful situation, it allows us to stay focused, but it allows us to also, to a greater degree, get out of the stress response, which allows us to think clearly, allows us to be safer at work. That was a long-winded answer.
No, but there's a lot of good points there, and I want to kind of unpack a couple things here. You talked a lot about, in those environments, kind of blocking out, taking that time, and it's one of the things that I know that if you're an office worker, making sure that you turn off your notifications in that time of gathering your thoughts, right? Being able to focus, not being pinged by your phone, by your Teams messaging or whatever kind of devices you have. That's a real important tip, when you're really trying
Mm.
to, get your focus, and also just, prioritize what's important, taking a breath, and maybe getting up and taking a break for a water, or just a quick breath of fresh air, if you can get that. But for the factory, for those working on the shop floor or in a factory, that's a totally different thing, because as you're running those machines and you got loud environments, busy environments, this is where supervisors, managers, lead hands really have to be watching their team, because those stressors, those environments, they can be hidden, right? You don't
Yeah.
physically necessarily see, which is where I want to drive my question, Steve. Maybe some tips more for the shop floor. I mean, what is some of the things that those shift leaders, supervisors, managers can do to identify, or maybe what would they look for if somebody maybe is maybe finding it, they're stressed, maybe they're overloaded, maybe they came into work with something that is on their mind and they're distracted by, because as we
Yeah.
know, this is where moments of mistakes or accidents or incidents happen. But what mindfulness can managers, tips for managers can you give them to maybe support better observation of maybe these stressors that are happening on the floor every single day?
Yeah, and I think this is an important thing for people leaders to be aware of. And it's also a challenging thing because again, as you mentioned, like when you're in a busy dynamic environment where there's lots of noise, lots of movement, and it can be hard for the supervisor to pay attention and to notice. But if we're looking for people who are potentially in distress, we're looking for some behavioral changes that might occur. So you're typically, you might see people who usually don't make many mistakes, making more mistakes than normal, or the quality of their work isn't the way it usually is. You might have people who are obviously, showing up late, leaving early, more attendance related issues. You might see people who are usually, maybe a little more calm and even keeled, getting much more reactive, reacting in ways that are maybe out of character, right? So snapping at people, being short-tempered, um, those kind of things show up because again, when we're under that stress response, our ability to empathize with other people literally drops off a cliff. There can be, and then so those are like there's the things that we can observe, and then there's the subjective things that we need to be listening for. If we have employees, really pay attention to what people are saying. If people are saying, I'm exhausted, I'm really feeling stressed out, I can't seem to catch my breath, those are all indicators, those are all signals that somebody is struggling. So the supervisor on the shop floor, not only are they managing production and getting that product out, but they also have the really, really important job of paying attention to everybody that reports to them. How are they performing? How are they doing? And taking that moment And when you notice it, like don't avoid it because avoidance only makes things worse. Go up to that person and say, hey, like when it's safe, obviously, hey, how are you doing today? And just say what you've noticed. I've noticed that, you've been you've been showing up late. What's going on? The more you just pay attention for changes in behavior, for maybe small mistakes or near miss, like safety issues, all of those things, it just pay attention and be, don't avoid it and be direct and bring it up, but in a safe way, in an appropriate way, in a psychologically safe way with somebody.
Yeah, I mean that's key. I mean, in my observation over years, you nailed it on the head. Where I've seen somebody that's normally calm, all of a sudden they become more aggressive. They become
Mm.
angry. They're throwing tools, or
Yeah.
they're smashing doors, or slamming doors. These are very important things to see. But then it's those ones that go very quiet.
Yeah.
Those are also ones that you really have to observe and maybe go up and have a conversation. This is where I talk about leadership and safety, because it's not just about safe work procedures and all these things. It's also about walking the floor and
Hmm.
being present and observant. You're not there to be the necessarily the rah-rah coach, but it's your ability to discern the different personalities that you have. And when those personalities are starting to change, maybe that's when you have a bit of a conversation and find out what's going on. So great nuggets there, Steve. I just it's providing people with maybe some tips is really what we're trying to do here.
Hmm.
um, when Let's move down to recovery routines. You've talked about it lots of times, and I've always said, we better love our jobs because we spend the greater amount of our time either getting ready for our job, being at our job, or recovering from our job.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
two-thirds of our, as you've said, 2/3 of our waking life is at our jobs.
50%.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's incredible, right? I mean, I don't know if I just depressed everyone, but
Yours is more.
hopefully not. Yeah, right. I know. Yeah, it's one of those
90.
things. Um, so when we're working with people, I mean, this obviously pays a huge amount, right? I mean, obviously commute times, they're not getting better in the lower
Yeah.
mainland, stresses of fuel, all this stuff. I mean, what can we talk about routines that we can encourage, by maybe having some town halls, some lunch and learns, but ways in which we can suggest on micro recovery from our routines and really try to restore some energy in people, because some people are just waiting for the weekend or waiting for that next holiday because they're just, oh, man, work is just work. And yeah, what kind of things would we recommend that they can do in order to better restore their energy and feel more energized coming into work every day?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a number of things, but before I get into those things, I think it's really
Sure.
important too for, the organization, the leaders to really normalize how important it is for micro recovery, like to take recovery seriously. Because if you're in an environment where, the environment says, hey, look after yourself, use your EAP, for example, but
Yeah.
everything is go, 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 go all the time, there's a disconnect between what the employee is being told and what they're seeing. So the
Sure.
organization itself has to say, okay, this is something that we value. We value it because, there's a return on investment in terms of profitability, safety, employee health and well-being. So first of all, normalize it. Give employees the sense of that they actually have support and permission to do these things. And why I like the idea of micro recovery because, if you're just waiting, you take your vacation, you're 2 to 3 weeks, and then you take it and you're already exhausted. 2 to 3 weeks typically isn't going to dent it. And so then you have another year of grind to get through. That, from a psychological perspective, isn't going to help us. And physiologically, it certainly is. So that's why micro recovery is really helpful. So what it is like really intentionally taking short moments, right? They don't have to be long, very brief, that help your brain and your nervous system reset, re-regulate. Because without doing that, your nervous system just starts to get more and more jacked up over time. And then you get into the territory of having chronic stress, which makes you ill and, quite frankly, shortens your lifespan. So, there are a number of things, and there's more out there than I'm going to come up with. And I think they're all individual and personalized, but some of the easy ones, right? Let's say that you're in a meet you live in the world of constant team or virtual meetings, right? Remember the old days? You'd have a meet when you were on site. If you were on site primarily, you'd actually get a bit of a break between meetings. We don't get that much more anymore, depending on how you're working. So between tasks or meetings, right? Stand up, move, stretch, you know, get into your body for a couple of minutes before you move to something new, because getting into our bodies and like kind of just being embodied and moving it around helps us immensely. It's a break from that cognitive load. I mentioned, and I tend to mention the importance of breathing a lot, because when we're starting to get stressed out, right, we're going into the fight flight response, our physiology takes over. Our heart rate goes up, and our breathing gets more rapid and shallow. What happens is that's also a trigger for your nervous system to say, holy smokes, the fact that I'm breathing like this and my heart pounding means I'm in danger, which escalates it. So if you can just identify when that's happening, say to yourself, okay, Steve, stop and take some slow, deep, intentional breaths before a new task or a difficult conversation. What that does is that, in a way, it tells your nervous system that you're safe, because your nervous system is going to be paying attention, and it's not verbal, but it's going to notice that, hey, if I'm breathing calmly and deeply and slowly, I must be safe, which allows that nervous system to calm down. So never underestimate the power of just slowing down and breathing deeply. Sometimes, you go into workplaces and it's got the horrible lighting, or you go to a floor and it's, bright lighting, or it can even be dark in some places. You're inside a building all day long. And if you work shift works, it can mess with your circadian rhythms. So if you can just briefly throughout the day take moments to step outside, get some fresh air, get some daylight, and maybe, walk around the building, walk around the parking lot, again, get into your body and really just kind of, you know, take that break of that change of scenery and soak it in. If you're having lunch, right? Depending on where you are, if you're in more of an admin type of role, every time I do workshops, I say, where do you eat your lunch? And most people, they tell me they still eat lunch at their keyboard. Not only is that like not giving you a cognitive break, right? Because again, that load is still building. It's actually eating at your keyboard's full of bacteria, right? So, and actually, I watched years ago on the news. Dr. Art Hister was taught they had some biologists swab toilet seats in the workplace and swab keyboards at your desk. The keyboards had the creepiest bacteria. So take a real lunch break. Get away from that screen. There was one time I heard this, like the 20-20-20 rule, right? Every 20 minutes, look at something 20 feet away for 20 seconds just to give your eyeballs a rest. So take your lunch, take your breaks. If we workplaces are, for a lot of us, places where we have a lot of socially important relationships, right? Little kids, they go to school and they make little school buddies. Often when we're adults, we hang out at work and make work buddies. Just checking in with a coworker, hey, how you doing? Having a chat, right? Just to kind of, create greater bonds between people, but also again, giving you a break from those cognitive tasks you were doing. And, as people leaders, like really just kind of like encouraging those teams to take a pause. Like if there's intense periods of work, right? The Alliance, we have a fantastic marketing team. They go all out. There's specific times of the year. You know, they take some period. They don't get many of them, but they take, pauses after these intense periods of work, right? Because if we're just going full pelt all the time, that's a recipe for exhaustion and burnout, right? If you think about, if you've ever been to the track, and you've been to watch horse races, those horses, they're just going full pelt, but they don't run them like that every day, right? They run them like that, and then they give them breaks, because if they don't, those horses are likely to get injured. Same principle is kind of true for us. So rather than thinking, oh, the only way to feel better is to wait for my next year until my next vacation, that's not going to help you. Start incorporating these small micro breaks into your day and work them into a schedule, right? Because you're more likely to do them and remember them, particularly if it's something new that you're doing.
It's great, Steve. And going back to setting the right environment and setting the right tone of messaging, I think organizations do need to really look at the break rooms, the lunch rooms, the amenities provided for employees. And again, we don't have open checkbooks here, but making sure that this is a place where people feel they can sit down and have their lunch. It's clean,
Mhm.
it's got access to fresh water. In order for people to, to get that life quenching water you need and the ability to sit and to have a lunch that is not necessarily full of stimulation, but at the same point you can relax and you can have a conversation with your work buddies and do that. And I've been in so many plants over my years, and one of the first things I do when I go in is I go up on a cleanup spree, whether it be the lunchroom or the shop floor. And I'll talk lots about 5S because I think it's the cornerstone of creating a healthier, safer environment for workplaces. But clutter and mess and garbage and smells, these all create, those stressors to people. When you
Yeah.
walk into a lunchroom and there's garbage everywhere and it smells bad and the microwave looks like somebody's blown up their chili inside, and it doesn't create an environment where people can feel that they can stop, relax, take that 30-minute break, where they can just recharge and reset. Going for a walk, having an outdoor area perhaps where, not all plants is conducive, get that
Mhm.
for safety reasons. But if you did have a green space with a table, with a place for people to sit in the sun, get a little vitamin D. I think these are really key points for worker health and safety, Steve. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a great point. Yeah.
And I think, those things also they convey a really powerful message. If you go
Yeah.
into a lunchroom that is dark and dirty and, and depressing to be in, that says something about how the organization kind of views employees, whether it's intentional or not, right?
Right.
We notice those things. And if you step into a lunchroom that, as you said, is bright, airy, pleasant to be in, that also says, hey, if I'm an employee, oh, this says something, right? This says how we're valued.
Well, it's a key point, and one of the studies I had with the advanced engineering department at the U of A, they came into one of the plants that I built, and they did some studies around not only our ergonomics, our material handling, but also just the environment. And they measure things like the air
Mhm.
quality, the amount of natural light, because again, we as humans, we need light.
Yeah.
We need the sunshine. And so when you're in a cavernous factory, etc., being able to go to a lunchroom or being able to go outside to get that light, that vitamin D, is a really key thing. And it was amazing. The study really showed how all these environmental factors really have an impact to overall employee health and well-being. So again, I've never had anyone come up to me and say, Wayne, I really don't like how clean you've made this lunchroom or factory. You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
usually the opposite. And so again, when we go back to just creating an environment for health and safety, I think this is a one that really needs to be emphasized. Let's
Yeah, yeah.
yep, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, and the way we work now, if we think about, since the Industrial Revolution, working in factories, from an evolutionary perspective, this is very non-human behavior. For most of our evolution, like tens of thousands of years, we have been hunter-gatherers living outside. Natural rhythms, natural light, movement, all of these things. And now we're kind of in these really artificial environments, artificial light, artificial kind of time frames. The human body did not evolve to do this. And so it makes sense that, in a way, we kind of struggle in these artificial environments that we've created over the last couple hundred years.
That's a key point. Let's move down to another topic around coaching. I think
Mhm.
this is something that I probably it was, when I first started managing plants, it was always about KPIs and outcomes, and then you realize, wow, there's a lot of coaching that goes on, whether it's new worker, young worker, or as people progress through their careers, becoming supervisors, managers, and then future people leaders. Coaching is it's always goes back to coaching.
Mhm.
And I think here is some areas where we could probably give some nuggets to folks. Team members may not always feel comfortable sharing that they are tense or anxious, and we know this, or even overloaded. Right? There's this little, oh, I don't want to let people know. I don't want to feel vulnerable. Right? That vulnerability that you might feel. And sometimes we're obviously too close to the issue. We don't see it. And I see that. Like it's that old comment, Steve. You can't see the forest for the trees.
Mhm.
You're so focused in your own world. Do you pop your head up? And one of the things I always say to people is, go grab a different observation point in your plant. Go up in a mezzanine somewhere and just observe what's going on. Not for anything, but just to be removed from your usual walk through the plant, and you'll be
Mhm.
surprised at what you'll see or what you don't see happening. And so, Steve, as a people leader, how can you maybe give some points and tips on how to see the signs of early strain and maybe some reductions on stressors? This would be
Mhm.
really, I think, a real good one for coaching.
Yeah, and when we think about, that role of coaching is critical because we can just tell people what to do, but usually that's only successful if you're on top of them, right? Coaching is something that builds people's capacity to learn how to take action on their own and in a safe way. But for coaching or for, and just in general terms, if you have employees that are struggling, and obviously, as a responsible supervisor or people leader, you actually have an obligation to ensure a healthy workplace. If you've never gone out of your way to develop relationship with your employees, don't expect them to open up to you very easily because there's the trust isn't there. So we always have to kind of focus on if we're going to have these conversations, you better make sure your employees trust you. And I still have to look this up, but I listened to a presentation a little while ago, and this presenter said, and apparently it was from either Gallup or Forbes, I'm going to look it up, that 69% of employers, of people leaders, actively avoid talking to their staff. Now, I don't know how accurate that number is. I mean, it seemed pretty high, but I would
That's
say
high.
in the work that I do, if the number itself is inaccurate, that does happen where leaders they just don't interact. And so the first thing you need to do if you want to notice when people are struggling, and obviously, we're talking about, maybe more quiet, more irritable, more forgetful or distracted, unusual mistakes, something like that, and you want to approach them, it's really helpful that you actually established a rapport with them first. And I remember, anybody who's sat through me in sessions probably has heard this example. But I remember I had there was a president of a company that I was at, and I was located in the head office, and we had offices all over, Canada and North America. But I would watch this president or CEO every morning go out onto the floor and say hello to people, right? No matter who it was. It could be the temp admin person, it could be the custodian, it could be the senior VP of marketing. It didn't matter. Whoever this person came into, he would say, "How are you doing? What's going on?" Right? Like, and these were brief touch points. They weren't long conversations. But what this person was doing was kind of getting a baseline read on how people were doing. He understood who they were. He would kind of discern small problems before they became big problems, but he was also being approachable. He was setting a message, "Hey, I'm here. I'm paying attention, and if you need to talk to me, you can do that." So I think one of the first thing a leader needs to do is make sure that they're promoting the idea that your staff can approach you. So if you go up to, if you're, so, that means that if you have a staff who's struggling and you go up to them and you say, hey, how are you doing? There's a greater likelihood that that employee will actually tell you how they're doing, right? And we actually want them to do that because if they're not doing well, that could have an impact on safety, for example, right? It could have an impact on productivity. So think of it as an operational risk to not do that. So get to know your people. It's not about being their best friend, but it's about being an approachable leader where people go, oh, you know what? I know that if I'm struggling, I can tell this person, right? So that's the key thing. No, be that trusting person, set the tone that you can be that you're approachable, and watch for those changes in behavior, right? And don't avoid them when you see them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole nother probably webinar around the development of people's emotional intelligence on how to
Mm,
talk and how to engage and be approachable. I mean, I agree with you. It's not about being their friend, their buddy, but it is about being human. It is
yeah.
about creating a human interaction with someone that they know that you're actually interested in how you doing? Are you feeling good? If is everything okay? It's such an important skill to develop where people feel that they can speak to you and feel comfortable that there's no retribution or that you're going to feel they're weak or maybe they're not doing something well.
Yeah.
It is a skill. It has to be developed, and the only way you develop it is by continually putting yourself out there and trying different approaches on that. So Steve, we'll probably come back on an EQ coaching session because I think this is something that young leaders, new leaders, or emerging leaders do need to develop the ability to communicate and connect with others.
And I would say, I mean, it's important for new leaders, but in my travels over the last few decades, I also noticed that senior leaders are not immune to this, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah,
Senior leaders,
absolutely.
there's a number of things that go on. I mean, obviously, senior leaders have a responsibility for ensuring the well-being of their employees. But in a lot of cases, senior leaders aren't very good at taking care of themselves. And that is visible, right? So if a senior leader is stressed or reactive or overwhelmed, even the most conscientious leader, that stress can seep through because employees, we're watching leaders all the time because leaders are the ones that kind of set the tone for how we spend our time at work. So I'd say that, senior leaders, they get to a certain point and the risk is that they think, oh well, I'm here, I've arrived, so everything's good. And I think that actually leads to more vulnerability because then that kind of, you mentioned kind of getting a different vantage point on the floor. Sometimes I think senior leaders need a different vantage point from how they're leading from other people who can guide that ongoing development. So I think it's important for the new people, but I'm increasingly seeing it's really important for the established leaders already.
For sure. There's always a bit of a mirror test, right? You
Mhm.
know, it's one thing to say what you say, but it's another thing, do you do what you say? And
Yeah,
are
yeah,
you looking yourself in the mirror and kind of giving yourself a bit of a checkup from the neck up, right? I mean, how
yeah,
am I doing? And
yeah,
am I stressed as a leader? And I know that we talked about it a little bit coming out of the pandemic. I know that's, seems a while ago now, but
yeah.
many of those leaders, had to put on the brave face and move forward, but did they really get the checkup that they needed to make sure that they were okay and that they dealt with the stress and had a way to deal with that stress?
Yeah,
So I
and
think it's
because they're in isolation, right? Leaders live in they live in a bubble, right? And there's stigma around leaders who admit vulnerability, who admit that they're struggling, right? So there's a socio kind of cultural expectation that leaders always have their act together. But being human beings, I mean, still have the same things going on in their lives that everybody else does. And then you add that the pressures of being in leadership and the isolation from getting those perspectives from people, right? Like, hey, how are you doing to your boss? You seem like you're struggling, or you seem like you're stressed out, right? And having those kind of conversations and the senior leader being open to hearing it. That's a real skill set.
yeah, yeah, no, I agree. I agree. It's that time, Steve. We're gonna go to a quick cheat sheet for managers. What 2 or 3 tips can you share to help managers and supervisors coach their own team members through uncertainty? And we are going to go to questions,
Mm.
so I'll leave that 2 to 3 tips. What do you got for us, Steve?
All right. I'd say communicate, 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 but be clear and consistent, right? The less, well, if there's uncertainty, that automatically increases stress. So when it's stressful circumstances, people respond better to simple, direct communication, even if the people leader doesn't have all the answers, right? It's You're never going to have all the answers, but that kind of simple and direct communication that's consistent. I already mentioned this. I'd say as a leader, be visible, be approachable. You know, no leader has ever got to know their people by being closeted in their office the entire time, right? That pushes people apart and it sends a message. So employees, they'll just cope better when they feel that their leaders are present, calm, and importantly, willing to listen. Um, and again, focus on what you can control, right? Remember, there's that important urgent matrix. So often, the important things don't get the attention they need because we're getting bombarded by all these urgent things, right? So if we can break things down for our teams into small, achievable actions, that can reduce that hopelessness because you see regular progress towards your goals. But it also can help, I think, teams regain a sense of stability or momentum in the work that they're doing. So I think those would be the main ones. But if I was going to say visible and approachable and calm with a willingness to listen would be the most important.
I like those. I think they're key. I think absolutely you cannot run your plant, your organization from your office. It's
Mhm.
impossible. You need to be visible. And I love that communication, clear communication, right? Do your team members understand the expectations? And if not, share it with them. Don't leave, and don't dump on them, right? That's the big thing. When you got a moving goalpost, that ultimately creates a lot of anxiety with workers.
Mhm.
Don't do that. That is a real key for disaster because they don't
Yeah.
know what priority is what. And then all of a sudden it becomes just a giant anxiety ball that they're going to be living
Yeah.
with. And that's,
Well, and it signals the
we
leader
get it.
doesn't know either, right? Because I mean, but
Yeah.
that's also a signal of leadership anxiety when things keep shifting all the time, right?
You
So
got it.
this has a
Yeah.
way of filtering through the entire organization. And whether you like it or not, leaders, you set the tone. Everybody's
Yeah.
watching you, right?
You bet. Yeah. We talk about it, setting the pace, the tone, right? So, great points. Let's move to some questions from those on the webinar today. So, let's start with some easy ones.
I like easy. Go
None of
for
them
it.
are easy. These are all hard ones.
Man, no, some.
All right. Yeah, you can handle it, Steve. All right. How do we support leaders and give them time to do what they need to do, but also not be inappropriate or unsafe?
That's an interesting question.
Right?
Give them time to do what they need to do without but not being appropriate and unsafe. So if I'm understanding, and I might need help discerning what this question is. How I'm reading this is there's a lot of urgency, there's a lot of demands, and that's challenging for leaders. And leaders still have to lead, they still have to produce. Would that be kind of close to how I'm interpreting that question?
You know, if I was to look at this one, I would say that, um, you know, it's about, you know, giving them, if we give them a problem, right, how do we allow them to kind of think about it
Mhm.
and, without rushing them, in potentially in a direction that might be unsafe or nagging at them or kind of coming at them multiple times. And I think that, ultimately leaders are humans, Steve, right?
Yes.
So giving them time to think, giving them time to process, to make a decision, I think that's where the question is coming from.
hmm Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, again, I think, when we talk about these micro breaks, for example, I wasn't just talking about employees. I was talking about every layer in the organization. Because if you have a leader who is feeling pressured, right, with again inconsistent communication, they're overwhelmed, they're overburdened. A leader's ability to stay focused on, in response to their team members. Remember, stress goes up, empathy goes down. That is just the nature of how, we are when we're under the stress response. So I think, and I kind of, maybe I think I'm a broken record, because I like to talk about psychological safety a lot, right?
Yeah.
So a leader, again, is a people leader, as a manager, a supervisor, all the way up to the CEO. Your job is to, direct, the energies of your employees towards a common goal, to motivate them, you name it. And when it's stressed out, what we can often typically do is revert to more command and control, um, more kind of critical. And I've had people say, well, how am I supposed to, when everything is stressful, how am I supposed to give direction to people in a way that they're going to hear it? Well, you can do it. And, so psychological safety, right? Now, psychological safety is not about giving people a free ride. It's not what that's about. It's not about, tolerating poor behavior. It's not about not addressing performance issues. What that is balancing accountability for like the company's goals and what you're trying to achieve with relationship. So even when a leader is stressed, a leader is under pressure, if that pressure and stress translates into behaviors that disengage employees, create negative feelings, you might have a moment where they actually comply, but they won't do much later to get you where you want to go. So it's about, when we're thinking about psychological safety, again, it's about being direct, but being respectful. It's about providing performance management in a way that is constructive, right, and developmental. And it's, in many ways, it's about cooling your own jet so that the message can be seen. Now, I'm taking a stab at this because when I asked earlier, I saw a thing that popped up and said, yes, that's what I was asking. So I hope I answered the question.
I think you got it, Steve. And I think, one of the things that I would also stress on here is that for the most part, many managers for many, many years, we I can say this as myself, as a leader, as a manager. Psychological safety was not something that you just were taught. Like you're pulled into a room as a leader, and
Mm.
hey, let's teach you about psychological safety. We've absorbed this, we've learned this. This is an evolving conversation where now we're probably more open minded to really speak about it, talk about it, learn about it. And so the next question was, how do we evaluate leadership skills? Well, I'll be honest, this is a real tough one. It's not something that is kind of do this, don't do that. I mean, there are some cardinal rules, obviously, right? But I think, Steve, maybe you can give a quicker, sorry, just be mindful of time. I want to get through a couple
Yeah.
more questions, but
Yeah.
you know, how do we evaluate leadership? That's key. How do we do that? Lots of leaders need training, right? Lots
Yeah.
of leadership need mentorship. Lots of leaders need coaching. So, Steve, I'll pass it to you for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different things you need to look at. Obviously, you need to look at their competence for the role, right? You can have a very likable leader, but if they're not competent in the role, it's still not gonna, it's not a helpful thing. So you want to obviously assess for their job competence and their overall impact. But I really believe that in terms of performance evaluations, there needs to be a mechanism in those where those psychological safety, those relational skills, those emotional intelligence competencies are assessed. Is it, how do you, and that's related to like team building. Are you good at building a team? Conflict resolution. How effectively do you resolve conflict between yourself and other team members and between the teams themselves? So I would always say, you know, incorporate those kind of relational aspects into a performance review, but give ongoing training about how to do that. Because there's no point in saying you need to have better conflict resolution skills when somebody never learned how to do it because that wasn't something that was previously assessed in their role. I would say
Totally.
we go back even earlier, and instead of just hiring people for their technical skills, start paying attention to their relational competencies because it's
Yes.
those ones that are going to drive the team over the finish line. not just the competencies, like
Yeah.
the skills.
Yeah, and I think the tendency is to promote somebody because they are technically competent in their role, meaning they are good at doing a certain, certain task within their role, and so we automatically think they could be a leader. Well, then a leader, there's so many more things to being a leader than technically competent. You
Yeah.
have to be technically competent, but you
You.
have to have these other skills.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I would say, in just a little plug to what you and I are working on, Steve obviously has a vast amount of experience, 30 years plus of experience in leadership and coaching and development of the EQ side. And I, from the other side of the plant side of really understanding the business, the things that you need to fundamentally understand in order to lead an organization as you go through. And so Steve and I are putting together a course, modules of courses that will deal with both the business side and also the leadership skill side. And so we look forward to bring that hopefully towards the fall of this year, that will really help organizations put their teams through some modular courses to help them develop both sides of this, both the competence side from a manufacturing side, the business side, and also from the leadership emotional intelligence development side. So
Mhm.
our combined experience, hopefully we'll have something that really is impactful for our members and organizations. Want to go to question another one here. Other provinces have started looking at mandating mental health first aiders. Do we see this as a direction BC will go? How hopeful is this when we're talking about these stressors and leadership? Now, we do know that there is a very, large work safe review around psych health and safety. And so I just wanted to say, I don't know if there's going to be a mandating of mental health first aiders. I have no indicator that tells me that's where we're
Mm.
going. But Steve, maybe from your side, do you have any indicators of where we're going to be going based on kind of your review from what we tentatively saw from WorkSafe?
Yeah, I would say the same thing as you. I mean, I think there is talk that's been going on a while that there is legislation coming around, psychological health and safety, reducing psychological injury, but at this point, not really clear what exactly that's going to look like. I would say that if other provinces are doing it and it's already been kind of, enshrined in legislation and policy, it wouldn't surprise me if it comes. If
Yeah,
it becomes something that's mandated rather than just a nice to have.
yeah, yeah, I agree. And as we get more updates, and I expect we will here throughout this year, we'll be happy to share that with membership via our webinars, our newsletters, and other forums that we have. So please stay and check in with us. Last question, Steve. We got about 2 minutes on this one. So how let me just read this here. How we build up our leadership and supervisors to be how do we, sorry, build up our leadership and supervisors to be able to identify and deal with these changing times? Is there currently training for them? And I think we have some of this coming, but we have some available. What are your thoughts, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think training is really important for anybody. I'd say anybody who is in a people leading capacity, whether it be from like a frontline coordinator all the way up. So we do have some currently. So for example, we do have a mental health management for leaders. It's a 4-hour session. The focus is on, identifying and responding appropriately to employees with mental health issues. But it also talks about, our responsibilities in that way. And that incorporates those kind of psychological safety skills, those soft skills that are really important. I also have something called core competencies for people leaders, and that really relates to developing those kind of interpersonal leadership skills that are increasingly becoming more important. And particularly as AI gets introduced more and more into workplaces, the more we have humane, effective leaders to help us navigate that, that's becoming increasingly critical.